Hey folks, welcome to the latest edition, the newest episode of the Absolute Truth Absolutely podcast. Once again presenting the topic for this new episode, your host and servant in Jesus Christ, Gio. I have a special guest, a distinguished guest, joining me during this edition of the podcast, this episode, new episode of the podcast, my beautiful, lovely, beloved wife, Sarai. Take a bow.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
You see, even in the voice, there's such elegance in the voice. One of the many reasons I love my wife. Now, some of you that have heard these podcast episodes for some time, have known Sarai for some time, and have written me emails consistently. We'd rather hear from her than from you.
Okay, that
Please
has to be a lie.
Remove yourself from the podcast and just make her the host of this show. Certainly, my wife is much more graceful than I am. I will readily admit that. And in what I would dare say is a moment of exaltation of my own wife, I have certainly learned from her how to be more graceful. That is something I have learned from you more throughout the years, and I thank the Lord for that. One of the many reasons I thank the Lord for you in that respect, among many other things that I have learned from my wife. But in this instance, the reason she is joining me, and fret not, she will join me for future podcast episodes as well. But in this particular instance, I thought it would be a good opportunity to speak about the subject matter that we'd like to talk to our audience about. And it is sexual ethics, in particular, biblical sexual ethics. The reason that we are going to undertake this subject matter during this edition of the podcast episode is that we have noticed that Christians are lacking as it pertains to their defense of biblical sexual ethics. And one of the most maddening things for me, and certainly rather paradoxical for me, is that there are sinners that, in my estimation, are actually making better arguments for biblical sexual ethics than Christians are. And we're going to give evidence of that during this podcast episode by reading an article by someone whom is rather well known in this, what shall we call it, field, I guess?
Yeah, you could.
But it is a microcosm of the very thing that we wish to point out, of the very thing that we would like to highlight and encourage people whom listen to this podcast, which most of you are biblical Christians, to really think, to really examine these things and adopt what we would call a not only biblical, but very sound, foolproof argumentation in favor of biblical sexual ethics. Because there's much more than we can know. There's much more that we could disseminate. There's much more that we can communicate to people when they simply ask us, but why should I follow what the Bible has to say as it pertains to sexual ethics? When we examine this, I hate to use the terminology because it gives the impression that it is merely secular in examination, but I think we can prove that it's all the opposite during this edition. If we can give persons a philosophical argumentation, again, coming from the Bible, that what the Bible has to prescribe for both men and women as it pertains to sexual ethics is not only God's grand design, but the best design, because it is God's design and the effects of adhering to that design, and we contrast that with the world's practices and the really detrimental effects of the world's processes, then I believe that we could be much more convincing to others, to at least to give them the impression, to which is true, that one ought to adhere to what God says in His Word. I don't know if you have anything to add before we continue to reading the article, which I'd like to use as a prime example.
No, you're good up to now.
We're good up until now. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to read an article by a man named Rush Valizadeh. I know a few of the people that listen to this podcast would say, I know who Rush V is. This man is a pickup artist. Why would you read an article that he writes? Allow me to say the following. I've read a few of this man's articles. I've consumed some of his podcast episodes. And I've noticed, and many people whom have followed this man for some time have said that he has changed very subtly. And it's something that he himself has said, that he has been God-pilled. You know that among the persons whom enjoy speaking about philosophy and things of that nature, there's this so-called red pill, alluding to the Matrix film, the blue pill, etc. Now they're saying that they're going through what they call a God pill stage. And this man, yes, admittedly so, he has been a pickup artist. He has encouraged men to engage in fornication, but he himself is openly admitting now, and this article will prove it, that he is seeing the error of his ways that he has undertaken for many years. And I wish not to use his article as proof that what the Bible has to say is true. Please, I ask the listeners not to misunderstand me as it pertains to this, because we're not going to use his article to prove what the Bible has to say.
Right.
I want to use it as proof as what I prefaced this edition with, in that it saddens me that a sinner on many occasions can see things much more clearly than Christians do when we have the revealed word of God before us. And we should be making these argumentations, not sinners. Now, I can't comment much more on Rush V's faith, even though he says that he believes in Jesus Christ and he believes that he resurrected from the dead. It's a recent admission that he made. I can't comment on his faith. And once again, I wish for people not to focus so much on the fact that we are using his article as a microcosm. It's not an endorsement, as it were, of Rush V. What it is once again, an example of how we should be making the argumentations, and I would dare say in many instances better argumentations, because there are better argumentations than what you will listen to what we are reading. But nonetheless, he does make good argumentations that Christians should have been making a long time ago. And it should be to our shame that we're not making those argumentations and sinners are.
And a lot of times, Gio, as Christians, many, not all, I'm not going to generalize, we tend to put on this suit of religiosity. And that tends to, over time, blind us from the beginning, from the get-go. Because we think that, well, we need to fast over that, Gio. Or I need to pray a little bit more. I'm not praying hard enough, or you're not praying hard enough. And they'll shine light on you on that. That is the reason why many Christians don't have a strong argument, because they're still arguing that you're still sinning. You haven't read the Bible too long. You haven't prayed enough. You haven't fasted enough. Who are you to tell me how much I should pray, read God's word, and fast? As a matter of fact, the Bible explicitly says that if you're going to fast, you shouldn't go out to the rooftop and announce it. That's between you and God.
Exactly.
But a lot of time, we tend to lose ground as Christians because we're still there.
Right, because of vain displays of spirituality.
Yes.
And instead of making our faith grounded in the truth.
Absolutely.
I mean, to your point, I'm glad you bring this up. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it brings to mind once again the text where Paul states to the Thessalonians, examine all things.
Absolutely.
Here we have, within such a condensed phrase, when you unpack it, you find how relevant it is to keeping oneself unspotted from the world. We find that Paul is telling us, in anything and everything that you do, or anything and anything you see other people do, examine that, weigh it according to the tradition that we have given. In other words, what Jesus, the apostles, Paul the apostle, etc., they're giving to the church, as it were, what God has revealed. Weigh all things.
Absolutely.
And it is in that examination where we can understand more intimately why God says, don't do this, do this. And it is from that examination where we can prove to people, we can give them a solid biblical argumentation as to the why the sinful way is erroneous and the Christian way is the way to do things. And you make a great point. Suddenly, when you have the persons whom, again, are just making vain displays of their so-called religiosity, of their spirituality, they blind themselves to these argumentations which are biblically based, which in their mind they're thinking that's the letter that kills, misinterpreting that text in the Bible, that kills, when in reality, no, it actually gives more life. Why? Notice how Paul states, I wish for you to grow in the knowledge of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Again, that's another phrase that we can unpack, and we see the richness of that teaching in the Bible. When I grow in knowledge of Jesus Christ, not only am I growing in knowing whom God is, but what God wants from me and why. And that gives me a greater appreciation. I'm glad you bring that up. Greater appreciation for the counsel that the Bible gives.
Absolutely. And it just proves time and time again that those societies change and time does change. The gospel doesn't change. The message doesn't change. Sin has always been sin.
Yes.
Lust has always been lust. Fornication has always been fornication. Now, societies over time, fornicating now in this society that we're living in, it doesn't limit itself. Now it's just this open box of plethora of ideas and how debased things can get. But if you have a solid foundation in the Lord, to what you were saying, well, now your defense is only going to get stronger in defending God's word. You shouldn't go back to that idea of what I was saying before of, no, we can't do that. We need to fast more. We need to pray more. How do you tell that to a society? How do you tell that to a generation? How do you tell that to millennials who are used to the argument now? How do you tell that to them?
Yes.
They're not going to be able to relate. Now you got to bring the gospel. You're not changing it, but now bring it to their level so that they can relate, and maybe, hopefully, one day they can come to the feet of the Lord.
Completely agreed. I'll give an example to prove your point, to highlight your point. We constantly hear persons telling us the Bible is antiquated. We need a new mode of thinking. When you analyze what it is that they're trying to propagate and promote, in fact, it is what's the old phrase, as old as sin? Fornication is very old. Adultery is very old. Homosexuality is very old. All of these things are old, but one of the problems that happens is when Christians don't know how to defeat intentionally faulty argumentation, many times they simply throw their hands up and surrender, and in many instances, instead of continuing to try to educate themselves, to demonstrate, to be able to see that these argumentations are faulty and they can be defeated with proper counter argumentations, many instances they'll throw their hands up and surrender and say, I guess I'll just submit to the culture because it's true, Christianity is old. I'll give you an example. We find that there are persons whom, under the auspices of we're progressive, we're progressing, we ought to allow homosexuality to be normalized. Now there is further descent into this madness where there are persons that are arguing that man-boy relationships, women-girl relationships are normal. Folks, this is stuff that was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's why God burnt them to a crisp.
Yep.
This is not new.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, in Greece, if you read Plato's Republic,
That's right.
Plato himself stated, for every man that serves in war, he should receive the services, and I think we all understand what he meant by services. That's the terminology I'm using to condense what Plato was advancing in the Republic. We should give them the services of a young boy. Rome was practicing these things. These are not new things, but notice how they cover the truly evil nature of their argumentation by simply making this reductionist dichotomy. This is new. What you're presenting is old. Out with the old, in with the new. Time out.
Yeah.
In order to disprove what it is that they are saying, for example, to prove what you've just said, a Christian should simply respond, what you're advocating for is not new. As a matter of fact, it's damaging.
That's right.
And you can move from there using some of the things that we have just stated. That's as easy as pie as it were, disproving what it is that they are advancing. But here's the problem, and this is an added problem to this. Many Christians are unwilling to engage in proper apologetics because they're afraid for various reasons. Some, they're timid. Others are ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is a sad thing in and of itself, and it hurts me to say it, but many people are. In many other instances, you have persons whom don't want their reputation or their vested interests to be somehow disturbed, and therefore they simply hide away in the closet because they are giving more priority to those things than they are to the truth and the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm glad you bring up that point. It's a very, very good point.
Yeah.
Now, let's continue, folks. We will read the article. If you need to pause, interrupt me at any point to interject, please do so. I will do the same because I think there's much that we can extract from this. Please remember, we're using this as a microcosm to argumentations that Christians should be using. Again, from the Bible, and always pointing people back to the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But again, these are parts of the argumentations that we should be using, but to our shame, many persons whom are sinners are actually making these arguments when we Christians should have been making these arguments a long time ago. The title of the article is Men Are Wasting Their Time. How much time do men spend pursuing casual sex with no hope of deeper intimacy? How many months or years do they waste in countries without building meaningful roots? How much effort do they exhaust with self-help, working out in gyms, or chasing material toys that make only skin-deep differences in their lives? I've met too many men whom are diverting most of their intellect, time, and energy into gaining leftover scraps of happiness from the life instead of building up their communities or nurturing a deeper love with one woman because of how toxic and dangerous both women and our communities have become. I began pursuing women for mostly sexual reasons in 2001. I must have logged tens of thousands of hours into the task. I've been also traveling or living abroad near continuously since 2007. I've spent a lot of time trying to fornicating, traveling to more effectively fornicate, and writing over 1 million words about fornication. I need to pause. I find it interesting that this man is actually using the biblical terminology to describe what he has done in the past. Most people would not dare call it fornication because they know that by using the biblical word, then it brings to conscience, as it were, what God has to say on the matter. So I'm glad that he uses the terminology. He continues, what did I learn from all of that? It's an experience that gets more dull with repetition like any other experience. However, it also leaves you with a massive hangover where you find yourself at a loss. What was the point of all of that? Is there anything I've truly gained? What lasting glory have I achieved? If I wasn't a writer, I would have nothing to show for my efforts besides memories that are as likely to make me cringe as give me happiness. Now, I'd like to pause for a second because there are some people whom, in trying to defend what he is trying to showcase as something that desensitizes you over time, he would say, but marriage becomes dull after some time. Only if you look at marriage from a selfish perspective.
Absolutely.
Because if you enter marriage in the way that the Bible says that you ought to enter marriage, which is it with a selfless attitude, it never gets old.
That's right.
Because you find contentment in the fact that you're making your spouse happy. That's something I've learned throughout the years, how to make you happy. And when I see you happy, when I see our children happy, it makes me happy, and it actually makes me want to strive to continually make you and make our children happy. It's something that brings contentment. Before, when I was living for myself, it came to a point where I realized living for myself doesn't satisfy me.
Exactly.
It wasn't until I adopted and I'm still working on it. I'm not perfect in this respect, but it wasn't until the scriptures opened my eyes and said, you need to adopt the mentality of a servant, the mentality of Jesus Christ, Philippians chapter number 2, verse 5 and on, where you would find true happiness. And that has brought contentment to my existence. Why? Because it's not about sex. It's not about satisfying my desires, etc. It's about making yourself, making our children happy. That brings me contentment. Yes, all these other things, they're added into the marriage package. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And they're wonderful things if they're used within their proper context. But the fact of the matter is that once you decontextualize all of the things which are a byproduct of marriage, what happens? You begin to cheapen them. And notice what he's saying. He took sex out of the context of marriage, and guess what happened? It became dull, became repetitive, using his terminology, and it became something that just continually brought more and more emptiness in his life. Why? Well, because if you think about fornication, folks, what ends up happening is that you turn yourself into a person whom gives himself over to satisfying animal lusts.
That's right.
And you turn the other person into that instrument by which you satisfy those animal lusts. It is a degrading thing when one thinks about it. But why aren't we using this argumentation coming from the biblical perspective to prove to people before they have to engage in all of this and before having to hit rock bottom emotionally and spiritually speaking? Why can't we make these argumentations to people?
No, it's, I don't know if it's harder on men, but women, and not all women, but I'm including Christian women as well. We tend to make that mistake when we feel loneliness, when we're lonely. Under the banner, under a biblical manner, when you go back to Genesis, God says, wait a minute, it's not good to be alone. So let me provide Adam with a helper. And he does. And we see it over time. This wasn't a helper. This wasn't a sexual helper. This is supposed to be his helper in all areas.
That's a good point.
Right? So, but then when we take it and we find ourselves lonely and, oh my God, look at how old I'm getting. We go to these lengths and make these decisions that the moment we've told God, I don't want you in my life, I don't want you in the area of my relationship, because I want to be able to choose whoever I want to sleep with, and I want to be able to choose whoever I marry, whether it's Christian or not, we open a Pandora's box. Why? Because you've already started wrong. Out of loneliness, out of despair, you've said, I'm going to go to sleep with whoever I feel like it. Well, the problem is that your foundation is already faulty in and of itself, because you've told God, I don't want you in the area of choosing a future husband, or maybe just a boyfriend, or maybe just a fling. I don't want you in that area. And then the problem is that when you start that way, then you tell God, I don't want you in all the areas of my life. But then we tend to blame God when something's gone wrong. Well, maybe you got an STD, maybe you got AIDS, maybe you got someone pregnant, maybe you got pregnant. And all of a sudden, it's God's fault because you got the STD, you got the AIDS, and you got an unwanted pregnancy? No, you know what? If those were the consequences, unfortunately, you got to step up to it. Why? Because the moment you said, I don't want God in my life, you decided, I'm going to have sex with whoever and whomever, whenever I feel like it.
No matter the so-called, and I use so-called because it's interesting. I hear people constantly talking about the burden that it is to have children instead of seeing them for what they are, a blessing from God. And to me, that goes to show you how truly depraved our culture has come, where we're looking at God's blessing upon our lives, which is one of them, which is children. Now we're looking at them as a burden.
And mind you, it was Margaret Sanger who first quoted that.
Yeah, right.
So they're only promulgating something that she has repeated over time in her books or whatnot. But you see time and time again how loneliness can have an effect on a human, where all of a sudden, even a Christian can all of a sudden make these mistakes. And then they have the audacity to blame God when a long time ago you told God, I don't want you here.
Yes.
I don't want you in this area. So if you've told God you don't want him in your area or in all areas of your life, you have to assume responsibility of your choices. And that's whether you're a Christian or not. You have to assume those responsibilities. But fornicating? I mean, like you said, I've learned over the years through our marriage that it's not about me. The moment we went before God and before our friends and family, and we decided to commit and make this union before the Lord, we decided to make that union and get his blessing, was the moment that I said, I want to live the rest of my life to make you happy. The moment the kids came, now I have to die more. Why? Because now it's not about me. It's about you and the kids. I mean, God, you and the kids. So I sometimes, a lot of times, actually, more often than not, I just have myself over here, and from time to time, I do my hair, I do my nails. But now I'm living for you and the kids. I'm living for God. And on a daily basis, I'm asking God, help me to be a better wife. Help me to be a better mother, a better sister-in-law, a better daughter-in-law. Help me to be just a better woman of God.
And that's the thing. I'd like to highlight what you've just stated and emphasize it even more, because you just alluded to a fact of a good marriage. And I'm not using that term in any way, shape, or form to be sanctimonious or to be hubristic in what I say about our marriage, because the fact of the matter is that we've had our fights. All marriages have their fights. Yep. You work out through them, etc. What I'm saying is this: when you have a good, sound marriage, you come to the understanding, as long as you extract this knowledge from the Bible, that you die to yourself, as it were, and you live for the other person, with the understanding that if it truly is a spousal relationship where each is interested in each other, You're going to take care of my desires. I'm going to take care of your desires. They're covered. So long as we're living for each other, then there's not going to be any lack in our emotional state, in our spiritual state, etc. We're going to look out for each other.
Exactly.
That's where true bonding happens. But again, I'm not saying that there aren't Christians who aren't making these arguments. I understand that most people at the end of the day, even if you make good argumentation, many will simply choose the way of sin because they simply want to sin.
Exactly.
I understand that, but it doesn't mean that we should desist from making good argumentation to save some. I'm not under the illusion that this is going to somehow, it's really an arrogant delusion. I'm going to change the world, people say. No. Even Paul himself said, I preach the gospel to save some. He knew for a fact that when Jesus said, little flock, few are those who find the gate that leads to life, Jesus lets us know, not everyone. It's going to be a small group that's going to accept me, that's going to live according to biblical principles, etc. I'm not under any illusions. But guess what? That didn't stop Paul, because the Athenian persons, the majority of them, said, you're crazy. We're going to listen to you later. There were a few that bore fruit.
That's right.
From his preaching the gospel at the Areopagus. There were a few people that came to the feet of the Lord. So it's not an issue of how many people. It's an issue of saving. It's an issue of whomever wants to come, let them come. So you make these arguments, fine. The majority will continue on its crash course with evil towards perdition. But you still preach. You still make solid argumentations for the sake of those few who will say, you make a good argumentation, and the Bible surely is the truth, and now I'm going to submit my life to Christ.
Absolutely.
That's the proper view, I think, that a Christian should have. Now, let's continue reading. It's a good point you bring up. Let's continue reading. If society were healthy, and if women were more traditional, feminists must have lost their minds over what he mentioned here. Most of my time would have been spent writing different kinds of books, maybe concerning religion or history. It's curious because when you and I were reading through this article before we decided to begin recording this podcast, you and I alluded to what he alludes to about an earlier time. Think about it. Most people in the past in the West were speaking mostly about writing books, mostly on religion, on history, on these topics. There wasn't the need, as it were, to write on what we're talking about now or what he's writing about now, because it was generally understood and most people abided by what biblical thinking is. Yeah. Nowadays, there's been an upheaval, an overturning of the sound biblical knowledge on these things, and that's why we're having to write about these things. We're having to speak about these things. So it's an interesting point that he makes here, a very good one, might I add. I would have a family, he continues writing, and spend much of my time nurturing the love between them without degenerate interference from the government or cultural elites. That's a sad phrase. Here is a man whom has engaged in constant fornication, has taught other people to fornicate consistently, looking at his own life and saying, if I would have made other choices. Yeah. It is truly a sad thing. I'm seeing in him, in some way, shape, or form, that he's shifting, and I hope that he continues on this shift, and I hope that he can rectify his life in some way, shape, or form. But it's sad that it had to get to this point. Absolutely. Instead of him being saved, all of the heartbreak, all of the emptiness throughout this time. He continues writing, I would look at my neighbor as an ally in keeping our community strong and safe for our children. We'd block out the effects of any cosmopolitan transplants, I love that phrase, who move in and try to change that. While there is nothing in life that is solid, my family and community would give me a stronger feeling of continuity. I disagree with that phrase because, again, there is solidity in life. God, family, Amen. Those things are solid. But again, remember what we stated at the beginning of this podcast episode. This is a man who seems to be beginning to understand, as it were, more biblically, as it were. So again, we're using this article as a microcosm of, in some way, shape, or form, how Christians should be arguing from the Bible to the Bible, etc. Again, this from a man whom has up until now been a secularist, teaching people to fornicate and noticing some of the things that he's saying, why Christians should be making these arguments, but they're not, to our shame. I would look at my neighbor as an ally in keeping our community strong and safe for our children. We block out the effects of any cosmopolitan transplants who move in and try to change that. While there is nothing in life that is solid, my family and community would give me a stronger feeling of continuity. Tomorrow, things that are likely to be here would still be here. Compared to the easy come, easy go modern lifestyle, where putting your, and I'm going to alter the terminology because he uses some uncouth language here. We're putting your male member, I think that's an acceptable alternative, inside of a woman is not even close to a guarantee that you'll see her again. And where you have, or any job you have or apartment you live in is as transitory as the next bus that rolls down the street.
Well, it's funny how he mentions about not the possibility of not seeing her again. Well, the problem is that women are acting like men as well. Not all women. I'm not going to generalize, but there are up and coming women who want that free sex too, without commitment. And they're willing to debase themselves to go that low to have a little black book as well. And go clubbing and go to bars and open themselves up to as many as men as possible without having a commitment. So I like the fact that he mentions that because that is true.
Yes.
Not only do men do it, but now there's an up and coming rise of young women who are also following that way of living that one used to always think, oh, that's only in guys. It's only found in guys.
Right.
Well, no, because now women are doing the same game too.
Don't you find it interesting, rather ironic, that when you mention to feminists that the whole point of feminism was to become more like libertinistic men, they become offended at you, even though that's exactly why they call themselves feminists?
Yep.
They call it empowering. We would dare say that it's as degrading as the men whom had advanced fornication. It's the very same thing. It's just now women are acting more lasciviously as men generally tended to do more in the past.
That's right.
Absolutely agreed with you. By the way, allow me to say this. Some people would say you should have never read this article because you had to exchange a word. He actually uses the medicinal term for the male member. He doesn't use the, what shall we call it? The typical slang of, the street talk terminology to describe the male member. But the reason that I exchange it is because there are some of our listeners that tend to be a bit more overly sensitive than others. So respecting that. Anyways, he continues writing. All of this wasted time is by design. He makes a good point. Oh. He makes a good point. But again, you can only make that argument if you inform yourself. Exactly. You were mentioning earlier Margaret Sanger. There's a bunch of Christians whom when you speak to them about Planned Parenthood, they're saying, what do you mean Planned Parenthood was originally designed to be an organization that wanted to reduce the global population of those that weren't white? If they haven't read Margaret Sanger, for example, Women in the New Race, then they would be propense to say, you don't know what you're talking about, even though they're the ones that are talking out of pure ignorance.
Exactly.
That's just to give you one example. All of this wasted time is by design. The oligarchs in power don't want us to become leaders of households and communities. Of course they don't. He makes a good point. Because government at the end of the day wants to centralize as much power as possible. When people are more independent-minded, that goes contrary to strong government. This is something that we have seen throughout history, folks. By the way, this small commentary I'm adding, it's, again, my own. He doesn't add this. He makes a good point. What was it that Hillary Clinton stated in her book? We don't even know if she wrote it. Maybe she dictated portions of it, but we do know that she has said before, it takes a village to rear a child. No, it doesn't. The way that God designed it is for mom and dad to rear their children. But again, she uses that phrase so as to inculcate this idea that mom and dad should not have parental authority over their own children. All of this is proven by the countless amounts of legislations at the local and federal level that have been passed stripping away parents of their rights. And we can examine those in the future, but let's continue reading because he's continuing on a good thread here. They don't want men to create loving bonds with women and vice versa. And if you manage to do so in such an inverted climate, permissive divorce laws will reduce the chances it lasts. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
One of the men, and I don't agree completely with everything he has written, specifically with the issue of the bell curve, because Charles Murray, there's a thread, as it were, there's a current, an underlying current in what he's written, where we're supposedly in an evolutionary manner, we're predisposed, as it were, to certain intelligence levels. And I disagree with Darwinism. And it seems that there's that thread that runs through some of his commentary as it pertains to the bell curve, where blacks are generally, and Hispanics, for example, are generally lower on the intelligence totem pole than whites are, or Asians, etc. That has more to do with culture than it has to do with genes and whatnot. A man who has written extensively about this and against this ideology amongst many people is Thomas Sowell. I encourage people to read his latest book on discrimination, where he challenges this myth that there's this predetermined action by your genes, by your ethnicity, that somehow you're going to be at a certain rung, as it were, of the totem pole, genetically, ideologically, mentally speaking. And I would venture against that. But Charles Murray, for example, he has documented for years what the effect of softening the divorce laws in the United States has actually done. And one of the most negative effects this has had is on children.
Absolutely.
Because when the parents are split, you have a fractured household. And it's been proven over and over again, even by statistics, that when children are raised in single-parent homes, the likelihood that they will not be successful in life exponentially increases. And think about the amount of children now that are being reared in single-family homes amongst blacks and Hispanics. It is at an all-time high and ever increasing. And among whites itself, it's also increasing. These things have to be taken into account. Now, they don't even want men to be self-sufficient. Instead, they want you to form weak bonds with other people and focus entirely on your belly and genitals, all while being a cog in the machine that gorges on GMO food, lusts after tattooed women, and consumes entertainment in a lonely urban box. He's absolutely true. Allow us to interject the following. We were also speaking about this and preparing our notes for this particular podcast episode. We have continually encouraged people that we come in contact with, those that the Lord has given us the privilege to teach. We're youth pastors. We also have the ability to, the privilege to teach adults. And one of the things that we have constantly tried to inculcate in people, and this has been one where we have received massive resistance, is on limiting their entertainment options.
Yep.
Because modern entertainment not only dulls your sensibility, it leads you to a place where it desensitizes you to what is morally repugnant. It also leads to inculcate filth, degeneracy. But yet you have a lot of Christians who will defend that.
Absolutely.
I remember a few years ago, there was a pastor in Michigan, I forget his name now, where he wrote an article denouncing Christians for watching Game of Thrones. He says, from what I've heard, this man never watched Game of Thrones. We will also say we have never watched Game of Thrones. And some will say, you are being haughty about that. Guess what? I am going to use it as a point of, I would dare say, bashing my chest, as it were, because everybody watching Game of Thrones, that's what everyone is doing. But that's not the only reason. We've stayed away from it because of the reports that have come out about that show and the things that it promotes.
Exactly.
Especially a lot of the scenery. Some people have taken to call it, I think, breasts and dragons. That's in essence the gist of what it is that they broadcast throughout that program. By the way, it shouldn't surprise us. This is HBO.
Mm-hmm.
HBO has had a reputation for decades to put licentious, lecherous content through television screens. But yet there were Christians that were defending this. There were even Christians saying, but I get a lot of Bible. They were saying, I learn a lot of biblical lessons from this show. Really? So you're getting biblical lessons from two actors portraying sodomy. We get biblical lessons from that. What's the difference between seeing these people engage in fornication versus going to a local strip club or a party where they're having orgies? What's the difference between watching it through a television screen or seeing it in person? Oh, but it's acting. It's acting. Folks, it doesn't matter if it's acting or not. the actual act is happening. You can't distinguish one thing from the other. But then again, it goes to show you that, and it goes back to the earlier point, look at what modern entertainment, that's how they call it, modern entertainment has done. He's making a good point as it pertains to this.
And we can't go far either. Look at the effects that 50 Shades of Grey has had in our society. Now, has had also an effect in Christian women.
And in marriages.
Why? Because this was considered a soft mommy porn. And I would say, no, it's full out porn. and you, the listener might be saying, well, how do you know? Did you read the book? Did you watch the film? No, of course I did not. But we read articles. There were even Christian moms, Christian women gatherings, reading this book, reading it, watching the film. Why would you want to practice this in the secrecy and bring this to your bed as a Christian? Why do you need to go to the point as a Christian couple, married, husband and wife? Why do you need to go to the extent to copy something that is mundane, something that is filth, debase, and practice that without going to God's word? God's word gives you the parameters on how to live a Christian life, on how to, I would say, on how to do everything, how to move, how to breathe, how to be a woman of God, a wife. It gives you everything that you need. But yet us Christians, we tend to say, inexplicitly, we tend to tell God, the Bible is not enough on this topic. Or the Bible wasn't specific enough. It was too ambiguous. Or, you know what? Since it didn't touch upon it, it stayed silent. So therefore, I'm going to allow anything and everything to come into my life. Well, I bring 50 Shades of Grey because the same group that has allowed 50 Shades of Grey to enter into their heart and now defend it. Now, this is the same group that has also said, you know what? There's nothing wrong with Game of Thrones. As a matter of fact, my children watch it. Heck, we watch it as a family. Why? What is there, as you were saying, what is there that I can now pause the programming, if I can, and tell my children, that is something honorable. Why should I tell you, let's watch 50 Shades of Grey, pause the scene and say, that is honorable?
Except unless there is an inclination to practice those things.
Exactly.
And now you're looking to justify it.
Exactly.
Which is the whole reasoning behind these Christians' defense when this pastor wrote this article, and they were just absolutely incensed that he would denounce them for watching such filth. The fact of the matter is that they were uncomfortable. They were incensed that he caught them in their contradiction.
Exactly.
That's what the whole point. And just to prove this, you have a text in the Bible which clearly states, Hebrews 13:4, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. But whoremongers and adulterers, God will judge. Notice that Paul, when he writes to Ephesians in the 5th chapter, if my mind is not mistaken, that we shouldn't even mention these things that are practiced by sinners among us so that we can live separate lives, pure lives, sanctified lives before God. And what are we doing? We're doing the same thing that sinners
we are.
And to do. And I'd also like to mention this point as it pertains to entertainment. If you think about it, these are things that become burned in your mind. There's been instances, for example, admittedly so, where we've seen certain films that we weren't expecting, as it were, where certain scenes have come up. And those scenes, unless you immediately block them in your mind, because they're there to tempt you, as it were, they stay burned in your conscience. And some people wonder, or some people simply don't ask, because then they start allowing space for that temptation to birth sin in their life. They don't wonder why. I have. It becomes evident because, again, those things, Satan uses that imagery, that activity to try to take you to a place where you're becoming desensitized.
That's right.
To all of these things. So what is the answer, Gio? Well, the answer is to not consume that which is created to debase you. Now, the key word here, if you look at Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, in the context of what we're mentioning, is undefiled. If you look at the term in Greek, it says amiantos. What does amiantos even mean? Well, not defiled, unsoiled, free from that which the nature of the thing is deformed and debased, or its force and vigor impaired. We can delve into the depth of that definition, because if you think about it, I'll just give you a cursory look at this. Free from that by which the nature of the thing is deformed or debased. Suddenly, it's like fornication. You take it out of the context of marriage, you're debasing the very act, the reason for the act. It's not only for childbirth, I understand that. There's also sensual pleasure for spouses. God designed that to bring intimacy to the marriage bed. But when you take it out of that context, suddenly, like I said earlier, you're not using it for intimacy, to grow nearer and dearer your spouse. It has everything to do with fulfilling your animal lusts. That's all it has to do. And notice, or its force and vigor impaired. How many times have we heard argumentations by persons in this generation? Why do I have to get married? Why should I get married? I could just go ahead and fornicate outside of the context of marriage and not give myself over to the responsibility of marriage. And therein lies the whole point of the excuse, as it were, behind the pretext, behind the normalization of fornication. They want the benefit that God conferred upon those that said, I will commit to this pact. I will commit to the promise. They want the benefit without the responsibility. It comes down to that. But I'm glad he mentioned this, because this is of absolute importance. Now, he continues, the more atomized you are and the weaker your relationships, the more dependent you are on the system, on the corporations and government to provide you with a cheap but damaging simulation of love and meaning that used to be real. You just brought up 50 Shades of Grey. How many women, how many men read the book, saw the films, and they said, that's what I need in my marriage? Something that is absolutely damaging, debasing. But let's use that as an example. How many people see romantic comedies, for example, and think that's the way life ought to be, when that is a complete farce?
That's right.
That is a complete farce. Not only are they exaggerating, they are actually cheapening life. It's like I've stated beforehand. I'll use the latest Marvel film, Avengers Endgame, if I'm not mistaken. That's the name of it. Why have so many people flocked to go see the film? It's indicative of a greater ill in our society. Most people, they use entertainment to achieve euphoria. Allow me to explain. The reason that so many people are so given to the cult of entertainment, because it is a cult, it is a religion, to the cult of entertainment, is that these forms of entertainment, what they do is they make real life look boring. In contrast, the effects, the things that are performed, as it were, which by the way are all false, but they bring a sense of euphoria because you're seeing something played out on the screen that can't be played out because of nature in real life. So therefore, there's a checking out of reality, and people would rather give themselves over to that which is artificial. The movies, the television shows, the video games, the music, etc., and give themselves over to that, because in that artificial, that fake world, they can undertake these things, versus in real life, they cannot. And that's why there are so many people, folks, that simply can't cope with real life because they're living a life that is completely imaginary. Among those things is the situation of the sexual debasement. They try to take what they see in film and they take it to the real realm, except to find out that there are dire consequences when you behave in that manner. He continues writing, I can't help but notice that they started banning my books after I began telling men how to create genuine connections from a position of masculine strength. It's okay to teach men how to have casual sex with sluts, like I did in one of his books, which is still available for sale on Amazon, by the way. But to create families from a patriarchal foundation, that's too much. Consider that you're hard-pressed to find reviews of Neil Strauss's best-selling book, The Game, that explains how it helped a man find a wife and have a big family, and that it was released by a big New York City publishing house, and that it's still available for sale while my book, Game, is banned. As long as you can keep men in a state of hedonism and casual relationships, you'll be tolerated by the system, if not outright promoted. I'd like to use one prime example, Madonna. Madonna has no talent. She is not a genuine musician. Yet why does Madonna continue to have an audience? Because she continues to exalt that which people, their baser desires, want exalted and practiced.
Absolutely.
That's what it's all about. And he ends, I can't control the era I was born in or what the agenda of the elites happens to be during that time, but I can control how I react to the information I perceive and the experiences I have. As I approach 40 years of age, I see, look at that, 40 years old, and the man hasn't been married, has no children, etc. As I approach 40 years of age, I see most of my hedonistic and travel pursuits as expensive life lessons than a source of meaning. All of this could have been avoided, by the way, if he simply would have followed the biblical model. He continues, my nature, and I believe the nature of most masculine men I meet, is one of creation, strength, and provision for the family, things we're increasingly not allowed to do or allowed to do only at an impossible cost. I may not be able to change the world and revert back to a healthier time, but I surely don't have to waste any more time doing exactly what they want me to do. Again, I need to reiterate, we are in no way, shape, or form, advertising for this man. We are in no way, shape, or form endorsing the totality of what he has done, but we are using this article as a microcosm of some, not all, of some of the argumentation that Christians should have been making to others when the culture, as it were, brings forth their exaltation of all things sinful. And easily we can come from the Bible, extracting these ideas from the Bible and presenting it to them in a manner which is consistent with biblical principles, and also showing people the detrimental effects of not only glorifying but indulging, practicing in illicit, sinful behavior. But as you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast episode, sometimes what we find ourselves with are Christians who simply say, temptation? Pray about it. What? Pray about it. I think I know what the Bible tells me about this. I understand that I shouldn't heed temptation, but pray about it. And I'm not diminishing, folks. I'm not diminishing in any way, shape, or form the advice to pray. But their advice, as it were, is simply limited to pray and you watch, just things will stop happening. On many occasions, folks, what actually has to happen is you have to give a person a deeper understanding of why these things God says we should not do them.
Absolutely.
And in simply explaining these things in a simplified manner, most people will say, now I understand how I should go about in resisting temptation. The Bible itself says, resist the devil and he shall flee.
That's right.
But how do we resist them? Well, you have to understand the machinations of Satan. You have to understand how these things debase you, etc. Once you get a grasp on these argumentations, suddenly it's much easier, I believe, to resist the devil, to resist temptation.
Absolutely. You can minister to maybe a coworker, a friend, maybe a family member, your daughter, your son, who is battling through this. Maybe they are Christians and they're living that both life, the worldly life and the Christian life, and they're trying to play God and they're trying to play church. God can't be mocked, but there's still souls that matter. So there is still hope in that. You can stand firm on your ground, stand firm on God's word, and don't be afraid to preach the truth, to say, you know what, give me a second. Let's go to God's word and let me show you what his word says and the right way to live. So that way before God, you can honor him and he can honor you in return. But if you continue in this path, you really can't expect much.
Exactly. Especially when you're trying to defend what you know to be indefensible.
Yeah.
Reverting back to that example that we gave of Christians who were defending Game of Thrones so vigorously. One wonders what would have happened if those very same Christians were to defend the gospel so vigorously and Christian living as vigorously as they defend Game of Thrones. Folks, this is all that we have for you on this edition. Once again, I'd like to thank my lovely, beloved wife for joining me. I know I'm going to be receiving more emails. We want Sarai. Take a break from podcasting because we prefer Sarai. Then we prefer you hosting the Absolute Truth, Absolutely podcast. That might not be a bad idea. It gives me a break in all of this of having to deal with people that write those sorts of comments. Thank you very much for your appreciation. Anyways, that's all the time we have left for this edition. We thank you so much for tuning in. Please remember to visit the website, godcblog.com, JIODCblog.com. If you have not yet subscribed to receive our email updates, we're not going to spam your inbox. We're not going to sell your email to third parties. Trust me, I hate third parties myself. I hate it when third parties somehow acquire my email, even though I gave explicit instructions to the people that have my email not to give it away. We will not do that. All we will do is update you as it pertains to what we are posting new on the site, so you can find out when we are posting these new episodes. If you are subscribing to us, you're listening to this through YouTube, please click on the subscribe button, but also click on the notification bell, because we know that YouTube and Google are trying to censor Christian and conservative content. And I would ask you, just visit the website. Let's decentralize power from Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Please visit the website directly, and please let other people know about this ministry. And if you have been informed and edified in some way, shape, or form, please consider making a donation to aid us financially in growing this ministry. Once again, the website address is giodcblog.com, giodcblog.com. Until the next occasion that we meet, may the Lord shine his face upon you.